This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Let's start with the frontispiece, not this one, another one. It represents a cosmopolitan encounter. In a small room, the allegories of the four known continents are gathered. Europe, dressed as an English gentleman, is offering a parchment with number written on it to Asia and Africa on the right side, and to America standing in front of her. This parchment symbolizes a book published in 1657 entitled Universal Character, by which all the nations in the world may understand one another's conceptions. Its author is Beck, master of Ipswich Grammar School, vicar of St. Margaret's, and correspondent of the Royal Society in Suffolk. A poem clarifies the aim of this common voice adopted during this diplomatic meeting. Dumb interpreter, tongues in brief, it allows to reduce all languages to one, and this renewed unity is supposed to favor the diffusion of science. Beck explains in its To the Reader his universal character would much advantage mankind in their civil commerce and be a singular means of propagating all sorts of learning. And in the poem, the author emphasizes the dimension of facilitation of scientific commerce, referring to the touchstone of early 17th century English science, Francis Bacon. Great Bacon's soul, my friend, divides thee, he found the plat and you the husbandry. Thanks to his language, Beck is supposedly prolonging or even surpassing Bacon's work. Beck project is one of the many plans for universal language flourishing in Europe in 16th and 17th centuries. They took many different shapes, from the quest of Adam's language, sometimes seen as being gestures, to the compiling of all the languages of the universe, or the invention of a method to easily translate from one to another.
Excuse me, do you think you could just move just a little bit, thank you.
That might not work. Sorry. Sorry.
Wonderful.
In the creation, like in the Polygraphia Nova of the Jesuits Athanasius Kircher, this quest could also conduce to the creation of a new philosophical a priori language, to use the terminology of the linguists. And the most famous of those languages, there has been a problem with the slide, sorry. This is Kircher's one, this is the gesture as being the language, and this is a slide showing Wilkins' project. This real character developed in his essay by the Bishop of Chester and Secretary of the Royal Society, John Wilkins, in 1668. The first step of Wilkins is to organize reasoning, is to organize all the knowledge of the world in a huge inventory, the book representing many tables and other senses. I studied, as it has been said, those languages and their creators in my PhD from, very modestly, an external point of view, following Pierre Bourdieu's approach in language and civil power. From the perspective also of the sociology of scientific knowledge, the aim was to elaborate a social history of a particular knowledge, because it took the form of a utopian linguistic science, of which it was necessary to study the social condition of producings, the actors of those intellectual and cultural practices, and their insertion in complex exchanges on a European scale, with its connections through go-betweens, as Mersenne or Peresc, between, for example, Rome and England, and its language planners milieu, studying Vingevi's and Salmon's work, continuing Rodwell Lewis's one, or Felicity Anderson's one. As in all scientific networks of that era, the question of translation and of which language to use in correspondences was an issue. But in this one, whose key concern was the creation of a utopian universal language, the issue was even more central. What was at stake was nothing less than choosing, not the language defined in correct usage, but the language of sciences and truths, that of the Republic of Letters itself. Latin was, for example, a classic focus point, as we're going to see. But the universal languages created were considered in themselves as universal translators. Robert Boyle spoke indeed of the common writing of Francis Warburg as a universal truchman or general interpreter. The goal of the language planners can be seen as the quest of a perfect language that would translate, to put it like John Wilkins, not words, but things themselves, avoiding this way a crucial dilemma of translation between root fidelity to the source text or betrayal of it in the target language. The etymology of the word translate, at least in its French version, comes from the Latin transducere. It's the same idea that has been said this morning. That leads us to the idea of transmission, the pass. The translator being a passeur, a cultural broker of the idea and the text. Translation should be perceived under the light of this etymology as an effort to make knowledge at the disposal of, to transmit knowledge, underlining the need to study precisely all this knowledge circulate and is appropriated, every translation being a tradactation implying negotiation, according to Peter Broecke. The Italian definition of traslatare, given in the Vocabolario degli Accademici della Crusca, published in 1612, is built upon this idea of cultural transposition and geographical shifting. Trasportare di luogo a luogo, la intrastere, per ridurre le scritture e i componimenti di una lingua in un'altra. And this last definition is interesting because Wilkins explicitly refers to this vocabulario as a model for his task of studying languages and building one. But maybe, instead of the idea of transmission, as we are going to demonstrate, the language planners consider their creation as translation, keeping knowledge away, or at least were rendering it obscure for the many and restricted to the few. A dimension which is present, on the contrary, in the definition, and it's going to be the last, I promise, of the interpreter in Thomas Dictionary. A stickler between two advariants, a mediator, a mean, a truchman, a southayer, a divinorum. This twofold definition is interesting for us on both its sides. First, describing the translator as someone who explains a strange language, but then describing him too as someone with the power of mastering a kind of secret language or language disclosing secrecy and order. When we have a closer look at the mechanism of this social network constituting the Republic of Languages, we can see those universal languages as literary and social technologies meant to be appropriated by a small community of chosen one. This is going to be the last point of our paper. The first one is going to concentrate on the Latin context of the circulation of a particular linguistic knowledge, and the second one will focus on the tension between the insistence on the universal translation on one side and on cryptography as another form of genealogy of the language plans on the other side. I'm sorry for the so French structure in 3 parts. Latin remains in the 17th century Republic of Letter the European sign described by François Broecke, because it persists as the language of sciences, resisting the challenge to the Latin monopoly on scientia described by Vanden. If important scientific work are starting to be published directly in the vernaculars, Latin is still the lingua eruditorum vernacula, a vernacular language of the learned, on the last of which D'Alembert complains, but only in the middle of the 18th century, stating that, I quote and translate, by the end of the century, a philosopher who would like to know the discoveries of his predecessors is going to be obliged to overload his memory with 7 to 8 different languages instead of the unique, universal, and conventional language. And the language planners, even if they are precisely looking for a possible language replacing Latin, we're going to see, are concerned with all the questions relating to its place, especially as lingua eruditorum. They are taking place in this Latin frame and have to make a stand. Latin is their communication language, being, for example, the language of 60% of Kirchhoff's correspondence, and the meta-language of many of the universal plans. In England, where English is maybe sooner adopted and is the meta-language of almost every English language plans, Wilkins, Beck's, Ludwig's, foreigners are complaining about this situation. In every older world correspondence, we can find letters insisting on the necessity of translation into Latin to give access to the book to the community of the learned. Choose first quotations. Latin incarnates a transnational idiom surpassing linguistic frontiers, and simultaneously, mastery of Latin could be seen as a symbolic entrance fee, in Bourdieu's meaning, into the Republic of Language. Paradoxically, even the translation in Latin of the real character of John Wilkins was considered to facilitate its circulation within the Republic of Letters. I quote, It is now being translated from English into Latin in order that it may, in this way, be submitted to the criticism and comments of all scholars. The quotations come from a letter of Oldenburg, written in Latin, to the Italian scholar Marcello Malpighi. Even a universal language needs to be received, to be published, or at least translated into Latin. The translation of Wilkins and its twists and turns has been studied in detail by Roderick Lewis. John Ray, who had been a close collaborator, drawing the table about botany, for example, is designated to be in charge of the translation and is working on it as soon as spring 1668. 2 years later, he writes to Martin Listener that he intends to set afresh upon and dispatch the translation. But it is uncertain if the translation was ever finished, and in any case it was not found by contemporary scholars. More generally, the universal language plans need to be translated to be understandable. Beck's universal character is directly published also in French. And on the contrary, Pierre Bénier's project of 1674, which we are going to have quickly in a few minutes, is being translated into English by a certain Henry Roos in 1675 under the title A Philosophical Essay for the Reunion of the Languages or the Art of Knowing All by the Mastery of One. Whilst the French language planner Antoine de Vanden has knowledge of many of the English plans through the intermediary of an encyclopedic compilation mentioning them, written in Latin by Johann Christoph Beckmann, Historia Orbis Terrarum. It allows de Vanden to state that his language surpasses the English ones. That's why the minimum Marat Metzen proposes the creation of an international academy of translators to give access to knowledge on a wider scale, using what he calls the common language of Christian Europe, Latin. Translation is indeed a key feature in the circulation of knowledge within the Republic of Letters and Languages, and is a recurring topic in the correspondence of its members. Some plans are trying to build upon Latin, incarnating the ideal translation language to create their own method or even their own language. Two projects in particular are willing to renovate Latin itself and or use it directly as a universal language. The first one uses Latin as the door to all languages and is elaborated by the Jesuit and member of the Republic of Letters, also collaborator for a translation of the New Testament, Pierre Bénier, in his Réunion des Langues, where he explains the theory or the feasibility. He is looking for a language that will allow, says he, to learn all the languages at the same time, by using reasoning and comparison. He has finally a preference for Latin because he says that it is first and foremost the language of Europe, and in particular the language of the scholars and the learned, it is the end of the quotation, who are the people needing language knowledge according to Bénier. It is on the same basis that Philippe Labbé, another Jesuit who entered the company in 1623, chose to lean on Latin to shape a new universal language in his 1663 Grammaire de la langue universelle des missions et du commerce, published in French and Latin. Latin is the best language according to him parce qu'elle est connue des Européens, because it is known by the Europeans. And the idea of Labbé is to simplify it, getting it closer to the French with, for example, a S for the plural, no declension, and simplified conjugation. So this choice of a Latin tongue has two dimensions. The first one is political. It is no coincidence if two Jesuits are electing Latin as a renewed universal language in the second half of the 17th century. This attitude should be contextualized in a quarrel between monarchy and the Jansenists, which has a clear linguistic dimension, this quarrel. It is explicitly underlined by Labbé in his preface. Himself, as a Jesuit, taking a major part in the polemic against the Jansenist enemy through the publication, for example, in 1661, of a book entitled The Etymologies of Several French Words Against the Misuses of the Sect of the Port-Royal Hellenists. He dedicates his work to the Académie Française as the authority legitimizing language in France, and described his task as one of saving the French from the ruin provoked by the Jansenists, designated as I quote, "Poor housekeepers looking for stinking and muddy swamp water instead of the clear fountain water they had in their background." The split introduced by Port-Royal between French and Latin to get it closer to the Greek is seen as a breakup with papacy, L'Abbé defending, on the contrary, commerce developed between the French and Rome for 1,200 years. The choice of a language has a political dimension. But the other dimension of the use of Latin is, as the quotation showed it earlier, the advantages of its social space, including the scholars, the learned, the member of the Republic of Letters. Many other language plans are trying to find an alternative to Latin. It could be described as an outdated idiom, the language of the fallen empire, not enough efficient, or at least not anymore. Wilkins devotes, for example, an appendix of his real character to this question, concluding Latin will be positively replaced by his real character. But the idea is anyway to fit into the social space formally delimited by Latin and to submit this Latin territory. The purpose is to delimit more strongly the frontiers of the Republic of Letters by creating a new language permitting to identify its members. Translating means here discriminating, and it's the second part. The language planners consider their creation in themselves as translators, as I have said. The motto of Kircher's calligraphy is linguarum omnium ad unam reductio, to reduce all languages to one, as well as unius linguae ad omnes traductio, with one language translate them all. George Adorno baptizes the product of his first reflection on the universal language a swift scribe and faithful interpreter. Beck finally, in a letter to Oldenburg in August 1668, portrays his own project as a pocket mercury to travelers. This last expression refers to the god of trade and travel, who is also the messenger of Mount Olympus, the Greek Hermes. This omnipresent and protean figure of the Renaissance is affiliated to communication, the one who invented the art of naming, the one who informs, translates, transmits. So it is not surprising Beck chose this reference to qualify his project. I quote, "The finding out of a universal character, which he facully contrived so as to avoid all equivocal words, anomalous variations, and superfluous synonyms, with which all languages are encumbered and rendered difficult to the learner. The idea is to avoid all the difficulties associated with translations, and as well as to avoid translation itself and the person in charge, the interpreter. And it is precisely the problem that Beck and the other language planners are trying to solve." I quote Beck once again, "Save the charges of hiring interpreters, besides avoiding the danger of being misunderstood or betrayed by the truchman misrelating his expression to foreign air." Beck writes, "The universal character acts as the interpreter you will always have in your pocket, taking the shape of a dictionary of 4,000 words with their equivalent in numbers. The author is aware that it could be impossible to learn all the world, so he announces the printing of a 5-sentence syllabus inspired by the Janua Linguarum of Comenius, which he refers to. The reference to Latin is coming back, but this time the new pedagogy is applied to the learning of a new lingua franca, replacing the one born in the antiquity. This is not coincidence also if the above-mentioned proposition of Mersenne of the Latin Translators Academy takes place in an exchange between him and the Palatinian Calvinist exiliate Theodor Ack in the 1640s. It is an epistolary exchange in which many universal language plans are mentioned. It contributes actively to the circulation of this knowledge. Ack sends pieces of information about the Arca Studiorum of Thomas Harrison or the hieroglyphs of John Johnson and William Bedell. And in exchange, Mersenne tells him about the project of the French language planners and inventor from Toulouse, Le Maire, but also about Kircher in Rome, whom he visited in 1644. Mersenne, described by Adrien Maillet as le centre des gens de lettres, the center for literary, is being within this network a bridge between England, France and Italy. He sees himself as an entremetteur, a go-between. It is thanks to Mersenne that the project of a small inventor from south of France, who, for example, received the 20th of August 1644 letters patent, recognizing him as inventor of many machines and instruments, in particular of méthode universelle pour traduire les langues, a universal method to translate all languages, le maire, gained access to the center of scientific knowledge such as the Royal Society. And within this task of Broecke, the universal language itself should be a major tool. That is what emerges from another of Merson's letter, dating from April 1635, addressed to another broker, Peresque, to whom Merson is presenting its harmonie universelle as a panacea for international intellectual commerce. I quote, "I imagine a sort of writing and a kind of universal idiom that could help you in your task as a broker by shaping an alphabet that contains all possible idioms. Discussion about languages, translation, a utopian means to communicate universally are at the center of correspondences. They are indeed feeding them, giving opportunities to communicate, contributing to the circulation of ideas and knowledge. But who to communicate with precisely? Translating as encoding. The comparison with Mercurius leads us to another different but related path. The metaphor is being used in another type of works. In 1641, John Wilkins published a book entitled Mercury, or the Secret and Swift Messenger, mentioned in his letter to Oldenburg by Beck. It is an history of cryptography and its different methods along centuries. The chapter 13 is known is dealing with a universal character that may be legible to all nations and languages. The conclusion of the author is that the discovery of such a character would conduce to the spreading and promoting of all arts and sciences. Universal language are connected with the question of secrecy and cryptography. That is one of their possible genealogy, as Gerhard Strasser's work showed. That is why it is not that much surprising if Lisa Jardine could note the personal copy of Wilkins' essay possessed by Anne Sloan, currently held at the British Library, contained, inserted in between its pages, a sheet of paper depicting the key of a complex cryptographic system. At the same time as the Mercury Encyclopedian Cryptography was concerned with the universal language, the ISE, universal language itself, could conversely be used as a handbook for cryptographers. But it is possible too that this copy and the paper inside were in fact Hooke's personal copy, Sloan having bought some books of its library at an auction in 1703. Among the more than 3,000 volumes of the Bibliotheca Ucana, we were able to find at least another work entangling cryptography and universal language. It is indeed in its diary, at the date of Friday, June 1693, that Hooke writes, having purchased at an auction Kircherie Combinatoriale, that is to say, the polygraphian. This project too is deeply rooted in cryptography. The first idea to work on it was given to Kircher, as he explains, following a request of the emperors Ferdinand I and Leopold I, themselves fascinated by cryptography. The aim was to look for a cipher to use in the correspondence circulating among their vast multilingual empire. But Kircher's plan is also connected with the figure of Mercurius, this time in the shape of Hermes Trismegistus. It is the mysteries of this ancient Egyptian knowledge that Kircher is seeking, in particular in the hieroglyphs, seeing himself as an Oedipus that would comprehend their mysteries. It is the reason why his museum of the Colloquium Romanum, a Roman hotspot for the sociability within the Republic of Letters, is full of others offering materials to Kircher's work on language. The relation between hieroglyphics and secrecy conducts to an interest for them in handbooks of cryptography in which their use is sometimes prescribed. It is the case in a book by Blaise de Vigenère, who wrote a treatise on ciphers and secret ways of writing, a book Kircher ordered in a letter of 1633 to its patron Peresque. The author, Vigenère, describes very precisely how those kind of writing, hieroglyphics, are meant to keep the knowledge within a network of enlightenment. Thanks to this sort of secret language, knowledge is kept away from the multitude, that's what he said, and designed only for the dignified persons between conchassant, neologism, built upon the Latin cum sapere, to know with, a knowledge and language only made for a people with the same kind of knowledge and science. Knowing this, the fact that the first manuscript version of the polygraphy aimed at a few addresses like Pope Alexander VII was designed to be written with the help of pictogram, described by Kircher as sort of hieroglyphs, is meaningful. Those pictograms could also be drawn closer to the Jesuit ethos of Kircher, and the use of cryptography in the correspondence within the company, the Jesuits advised as soon as 1547 in the instruction of Juan de Polaco, as this example of the document taken out of the Jesuit archive showed. The pictogram can be related to the pictogram used in the manuscript version of the polygraphy by Kircher. In both interpretations, the polygraphy conceived as a universal language is also at the same time a code designed to disseminate a knowledge only amongst chosen persons. That is why Kircher, even when the book is printed, continues to send it especially to persons of this network accompanied by letters. To use Nick Wilding's words, the printed book paradoxically circulated in a manuscript economy. And Kircher underlines himself the double dimension of its language in the letter accompanying the book sent to Jean de Casimir of Poland. Kircher explains that his recently printed book allows, I quote, to understand whatever language and write in it, even if you don't have any knowledge of it. At the same time, it is a cipher to unveil the secret within to whom you want and render it impenetrable to someone else. And that leads us to the conclusion. 5 more minutes. Whereas translation is usually an effort to give access to knowledge, the language planners are considering translation in the languages they created as a way not to give access to the knowledge, or at least to keep it in particular hands, as the links established between those languages and cryptography have shown. The very limited, effective reception of those languages, not in the discussions and exchanges thereof, but in the use of the language itself, confirms this interpretation. Concerning Kircher's polygraphy, for example, the only letter using the method is written by the Cistercian Juan Caramel Lopowitz. It starts with a message written in Kircher's passigraphy and then translated, thanks to Kircher's work, in Latin, Italian, Spanish, German. In spite of the many linguistic problems of this automatic translation, what is interesting to note is that this letter is in fact inscribed in Kircher's strategy. Caramel was indeed for many years a member of his network and was one of the addressees of the book. In the missive enclosed, the Jesuit explained his language was devoted to the princes and to the lovers of curious doctrines, of which Caramel was, being also designated as mediator of the Republic of Letters, Literariae Republicae Arbitro. Caramel, in fact, activated his own network to have the letter translated in all the languages mentioned. Universal languages are meant to be appropriated by men belonging to the Republic of Letters, precisely imaginated and constructed to be universal. It is a language designed for the cosmopolitans, the citizen of the world. The social technology associated with the language is as important as the material technology itself. In Wilkins' case, the reception is very limited too. It is known that one of the few occurrences of the real character outside the essay can be found in the plate of the description of helioscopes of 1676 by Robert Hooke. As it is the case for its elaboration, studied by Roger Letters, the reception of the project remains a corporate one, mediated by the networks of the Royal Society, of which it is obviously a member. But let us have a closer, quick look at the passage and what it holds. Hooke uses the real character when mentioning one of his inventions concerning balance spring regulator. for a pocket watch, for which he is engaged in a scientific polemic with Christian Huygens, and here is how it justifies its use. I could wish that all things of this nature were communicated with the character, and later, and I have this further to desire of my reader, who will be at the pains to decipher and understand this description, that he will only make use of it for his own information, and not communicate the explication thereof to any that has not had the same curiosity with himself. We can perceive here the tension between universality and cryptography. One of Hooke's purposes is to make some publicity for the already forgotten language created by Wilkins, but the use of the real character by Hooke is inscribed to in the habitus of the Royal Society in the context of scientific polemic, the purpose being to preserve an invention from the rivalry. The expression of Hooke, designing the text in the real character only to the true lovers of art, is not without reminding, in a different context, Kirchhoff's expression keeping his own character for curios juris doctrinae amantibus. Besides the reception of the languages themselves, the reception of the universal language plans sets in motion, as we have seen, a network of scholars, brokers, learned, exchanging on that question. Conceiving their schemes as universal translators, the plans are finally a code designed for merit, discussing about them. There are languages for the language planners, since Hooke and Caramel, with his little-known apparatus philosophicus, can be enjoined to this circle. Language planners, measuring themselves one to another, like Wilkins disqualifying Kirchhoff or Labbé's project in his book, A Royal Society's Project, against Jesuit Latin ones. In the context of the 17th century Europe, the Latin monopoly is starting to be shaken, being in competition with the vernaculars. But meanwhile, Latin is also not anymore the monopoly of the learned, with the diffusion of colleges and or tools like the colloquium, for example. So that the universal languages could be seen as created to offer a new tool for the regaining of one of the features of the member of the Republic of Letters, the mastering of languages of knowledge. Considered as code, languages of distinction, being very hard and requiring specific skills to be mastered, the universal languages are reintroducing a monopoly. They help to translate the social network, the universal language, sort of reinvesting the social space left by the lab. Thank you.